Picture this. 30,000 years before Christ, when the world was a fundamentally different place. We're talking about an Earth where glaciers the size of modern mountain ranges stretched across continents, where winter wasn't just cold, it was an existential threat that could wipe out entire groups of humans in a matter of weeks. This wasn't the kind of winter where you complain about your heating bill. This was winter as the ultimate predator. In the shadow of one of these frozen behemoths, a man named Grok of the River People was watching his world slowly collapse. Now, Grok wasn't some Hollywood caveman, he was as intelligent as you or me, with the same capacity for love, fear, and desperate innovation that drives human beings today. And right now, he was watching his 8-year-old daughter's ribs begin to show through her increasingly thin skin as another hunter returned to their cave empty-handed. The mammoths think elephants, but bigger, hairier, and absolutely crucial to survival, had vanished south 3 moons ago. These weren't just any animals, they were walking grocery stores, fuel depots, and clothing factories all rolled into one massive, life-sustaining package. When the mammoths left, they took with them thousands of pounds of meat, fat for fuel, hide for shelter, and bones for tools. Their departure was like watching your entire civilization walk away into the distance. But here's where it gets really desperate. The river people had done everything right according to their traditional knowledge. They had stored meat dried in the ancient way under autumn sun, following techniques passed down through countless generations. This was their insurance policy, their hedge against exactly this kind of disaster. Except their insurance policy had failed catastrophically. The stored meat had turned green with rot during an unseasonably warm spell. Imagine opening your refrigerator to find that every single item inside had spoiled, simultaneously. Now imagine that refrigerator contains literally every calorie standing between your family and starvation. That's what Grok was facing. In the smoke-filled cave, where 23 souls huddled against the approaching freeze, and when I say approaching, I mean the kind of cold that could kill you in hours if you weren't prepared, the tribal hierarchy was about to make a decision that would determine who lived and who died. Tribal elder Tharak, a man whose word was essentially law, commanded that the last portion of edible meat be given to the strongest hunters. This wasn't cruelty, it was brutal mathematics. In a survival situation, you keep alive the people most likely to bring back food. It's the same logic that governs lifeboat scenarios, but played out in a cave 30,000 years ago, with the lives of children and grandparents hanging in the balance. But here's where our story takes an interesting turn. Grok's grandmother, a woman named Iska, had been whispering ancient secrets, knowledge she'd gained from doing something that might seem simple to us, but was revolutionary for her time. She watched animals. Specifically, she watched them lick white stones near mysteriously preserved carcasses in salt caves beyond the eastern ridge. Now, think about what this means. In a world where human knowledge was limited to what your tribe had experienced and passed down through oral tradition, Iska was engaging in what we'd recognize today as scientific observation. She was looking at natural phenomena and drawing conclusions that went beyond traditional wisdom. The tension in that cave must have been unbelievable. Picture 23 people, most of them related, watching their loved ones slowly starve, while sitting on potentially revolutionary knowledge that violated everything they'd been taught about how the world worked. When Grok suggested trying his grandmother's forbidden method, it created an explosion that nearly tore the tribe apart. Tharak didn't just disagree, he accused Grok of proposing dark magic that would anger the spirits of the hunt. In a world where spiritual beliefs and survival strategies were completely intertwined, this wasn't just a scientific debate. It was tantamount to suggesting they abandon their gods while staring death in the face. The tribal council that convened by firelight wasn't a casual discussion, it was a life-or-death tribunal. Grok's position as third-best tracker in the tribe saved his life, but just barely. His ranking meant his voice carried just enough weight to avoid immediate execution, but not enough to override 30,000 years of accumulated tradition. Here's where Grok made a calculated gamble that reveals just how desperate the situation had become. He proposed demonstrating the technique on a single deer carcass, essentially offering to stake his life on an untested theory based on his grandmother's observations of animal behavior. The tribal council's decision was brutal in its fairness. Banishment, with a chance at redemption. If Grok returned in 2 moons with edible meat using his grandmother's forbidden method, he would be welcomed back as a hero. If he failed, his bones would join the countless others who had challenged the old ways and paid the ultimate price. Think about the weight of that decision. Grok was essentially being told, go out into the harshest environment on Earth during the deadliest season, armed with nothing but an unproven theory and his grandmother's whispered secrets. Success meant saving not just his own life, but potentially revolutionizing how his people survived the winter. Failure meant becoming another cautionary tale about the dangers of abandoning tradition. As Grok gathered his meager supplies and prepared to venture into the frozen wasteland, he carried with him more than just hopes for preservation techniques. He carried the future of human innovation itself, the radical idea that observation, experimentation, and careful reasoning might be more powerful than inherited wisdom. The question that would determine the fate of his people, and perhaps the entire human project, was simple. Could one desperate man's grandmother have unlocked a secret that would change everything? What happened next in those salt caves would either validate the most dangerous gamble in human history or add another skeleton to the growing pile of winter's victims. Grok's journey to the salt caves was nothing short of a death march through a landscape that seemed designed to kill human beings. We're talking about terrain where every step could be your last hidden crevasses that could swallow a man whole, ice so treacherous that even the most experienced hunters had been known to vanish without a trace, and temperatures that could freeze exposed skin in minutes. But as Grok stumbled through his fever dreams during those desperate nights huddled in makeshift shelters, his mind kept drifting back to his grandmother's story. And this is where we need to understand something crucial about Iska's discovery. It didn't happen overnight, and it certainly didn't happen by accident. 20 winters earlier, when Iska was a young mother with keen eyes and an insatiable curiosity, she had noticed something that everyone else had simply accepted as normal. Deer and wild goats would travel impossible distances. We're talking about journeys that would exhaust these animals for days just to reach certain caves where they would lick white rocks before departing. Now, think about this from Iska's perspective. In a world where every calorie burned had to be justified by survival necessity, why would these animals expend precious energy on what appeared to be completely pointless behavior? Any other person might have dismissed it as animal stupidity, but Iska possessed something that would prove revolutionary: scientific curiosity. She began to observe more carefully. She noticed that carcasses near these white rock formations remained edible far longer than they should have. In a world where meat spoilage could mean the difference between life and death, this was like discovering fire all over again. She started experimenting, and let me emphasize how dangerous this was in a society where deviating from established practices could get you killed. Her experiments with mixing the white crystals, what we know as salt, with bitter herbs and pine smoke, created something that seemed like magic to people who had never seen chemical preservation in action. She could keep meat edible through multiple seasons, creating a surplus that could theoretically sustain a tribe through the harshest conditions imaginable. But here's the political reality that forced Iska to keep this revolutionary knowledge hidden. The shaman's power rested entirely on his role in blessing the traditional wind-drying rituals. Challenging these methods wasn't just questioning technique, it was threatening the entire social structure that held the tribe together. In a world where spiritual authority and survival knowledge were completely intertwined, Iska's discovery was essentially heretical, so she kept quiet, passing her knowledge only to her grandson through whispered conversations and secretive demonstrations, watching year after year as people died from preventable starvation, while she possessed the knowledge that could save them. Now, fast forward to Grok's return after 2 full moons of hell. Picture the scene. A tribe that had been reduced to gnawing birch bark and seriously considering the unthinkable, consuming the bodies of those who had already starved to death. These people were beyond desperate. They were already calculating which of their loved ones might die next. Into this scene of absolute despair walks Grok, carrying 40 pounds of perfectly preserved venison that looked and smelled like it had been killed yesterday. The meat was pink, sweet-smelling, and so obviously fresh that it seemed impossible to hunters who had been watching their families waste away. The shaman, Korvac, immediately declared the meat cursed, and from his perspective, this made perfect sense. In a world where the natural order was maintained through spiritual rituals and traditional practices, Grok's success represented a fundamental challenge to everything the tribe believed about how the world worked. What followed was trial by combat, not just a fight, but a test of divine favor. Grok would face Tharak's son, Brutus, the tribe's strongest warrior, in single combat. The winner would be judged by the spirits to be in the right. Now, here's where the story gets really interesting. Grok was weakened by his ordeal in the caves, suffering from frostbite, exhaustion, and malnutrition. Under normal circumstances, Brutus would have crushed him like an insect, but Grok had one advantage that no one had anticipated. Brutus was starving. The fight became legendary, not for its violence, but for its strategy. Grok, too weak for direct confrontation, used the warrior's hunger against him. He employed evasion tactics, making Brutus chase him around the combat circle, forcing the stronger man to burn precious calories he simply didn't have. It was like watching a master chess player defeat a superior opponent through pure strategic thinking. When Brutus finally collapsed, not from injury, but from simple starvation-induced exhaustion, it sent a message that reverberated through every aspect of tribal society. The old ways hadn't just failed. They had been decisively beaten by innovation and careful observation. Chief Horvath faced a decision that would determine his people's future. He could cling to tradition and watch his tribe slowly die, or he could embrace this revolutionary preservation method and risk the spiritual consequences. His choice was pragmatic and brilliant. He decided to integrate Grok's discovery into their existing belief system rather than replacing it entirely. This created a cultural revolution that went far beyond simple food preservation. Hunting parties could now range farther than ever before, knowing their kills wouldn't spoil during long treks home. They could take risks that would have been suicidal under the old system, pursuing game into territories that had been previously unreachable. But the real genius was in how they managed the spiritual aspects. Horvath, rather than fighting the change, insisted that salt gathering required ritual purification. They created preservation songs that encoded the precise ratios of salt to meat, turning practical knowledge into sacred wisdom. The establishment of the Salt Moon ceremony transformed Grok's desperate innovation into a cornerstone of tribal identity. Within a single generation, the river people had gone from a struggling band of survivors to the most successful tribe in their region. But their success would soon attract attention from neighbors who wanted to know their secrets, and some who were willing to kill for them. The revolution in salt and smoke had begun, but the real test would come when other tribes learned what the river people had discovered and decided they wanted those secrets for themselves. Word travels fast in a world where survival depends on knowing who has what resources and who doesn't. Within 5 winters of Grok's discovery, stories of the river people's miraculous survival had spread across the vast network of Paleolithic tribes like wildfire through dry grass. But this wasn't just gossip, this was intelligence that could mean the difference between life and death for entire communities. The information traveled through the ancient equivalent of social media, intermarriage ceremonies where young people from different tribes would meet and share stories, trading parties carrying news along with goods, and desperate refugees from starving clans who arrived bearing tales of impossible abundance. Imagine the impact of these stories on people who had just watched half their families die during a particularly brutal winter. The Shadow Mountain tribe was the first to act on this intelligence. Led by war chief Ragnar, a man whose reputation for violence was matched only by his strategic brilliance, they made a decision that would change the course of human history. Rather than asking to learn the river people's secrets, rather than proposing trade or alliance, they decided to simply take what they wanted by force. This led to something unprecedented in human experience, the first resource war in recorded memory. Not over hunting grounds, which had been fought over since time immemorial, not over water sources or shelter caves, but over access to preservation technology, over the knowledge and materials needed to keep food from spoiling. The Battle of White Rock wasn't just a skirmish between 2 tribes. When word spread that Ragnar was moving to seize the largest salt deposit ever discovered, it drew warriors from 6 different tribes, each desperate to secure access to this revolutionary technology. Picture 300 of the toughest, most desperate fighters in human history converging on a single location, each knowing that control of these caves could determine whether their people lived or died through the next winter. The battle itself was unlike anything these people had ever experienced. Traditional tribal conflicts were usually brief. Violent affairs settled in a day or less. But the Battle of White Rock raged for 3 days and nights, as different factions fought not just against each other, but for the very concept of who would control this new form of wealth. Into this chaos stepped Grok, now recognized as a master of preservation techniques, but certainly not trained as a diplomat or military strategist. What he proposed was so radical that it nearly got him killed on the spot. Shared access to the salt caves in exchange for shared knowledge. Think about how revolutionary this concept was. These people lived in a world where resources were scarce, and knowledge was hoarded as a matter of survival. The idea of voluntarily sharing your most valuable secrets with potential enemies was completely contrary to everything they understood about how the world worked. But Grok had something more powerful than weapons or threats. He had a vision of abundance that transcended traditional zero-sum thinking. He argued that if everyone had access to preservation technology, everyone would be more successful at hunting and storing food. More successful tribes meant more trade opportunities, more intermarriage possibilities, and ultimately, more security for everyone. The Salt Treaty that emerged from these negotiations, scratched into mammoth ivory in symbols that represented humanity's first international agreement, established something that wouldn't be seen again for thousands of years. A protected trade network with standardized currency and neutral zones. The currency was preserved meat itself, measured in standardized portions that could be traded across vast distances. But the real innovation was the concept of salt routes as neutral territory protected zones where even blood enemies could meet safely to trade. Imagine the level of trust and cooperation required to make such a system work in a world where violence was the default solution to most conflicts. Grok's decision to reveal his advanced preservation techniques combining salt curing with specific wood smoke and fermented herbs created what we might recognize today as a technological arms race. Each tribe began developing regional variations using whatever local resources they could find. Coastal tribes discovered that adding seaweed to their salt mixtures created preservation methods that worked particularly well for fish and sea mammals. Mountain clans learned to incorporate pine resin, which not only helped preserve meat but added flavors that made stored food more palatable during long winters. Prairie peoples found that certain grass ashes enhanced preservation while adding nutrients that helped prevent the diseases that often accompanied exclusive meat diets. This wasn't just technological advancement, it was the beginning of regional specialization and long-distance trade. For the first time in human history, tribes were developing unique advantages that made them valuable trading partners rather than just competitors for the same resources. The story of young Mira exemplifies how these preservation techniques enabled entirely new forms of human mobility. This teenager undertook a 2,000-mile journey, a distance that would challenge modern backpackers with advanced equipment carrying preserved reindeer to trade with southern tribes for obsidian and decorative shells. Such a journey would have been absolutely impossible under the old preservation methods. Traditional dried meat would have spoiled long before she reached her destination, making the trip not just pointless but suicidal. But with advanced salt-curing techniques, her meat remained edible throughout the entire 3-month trek, enabling trade relationships that connected tribes separated by distances that might as well have been different continents. The population explosion that followed these innovations was dramatic beyond anything these people had ever experienced. Tribes that had struggled to maintain 20 or 30 members suddenly found themselves supporting communities of 200 or more. Children who would have died during harsh winters were surviving to adulthood. Elderly members who possessed crucial knowledge were living long enough to pass it on to the next generation. But success created new problems that no one had anticipated. Traditional leadership structures that worked for small, desperate groups started breaking down under the pressure of managing larger, more complex communities. The simple hierarchy of strongest hunter leads the tribe became inadequate when you needed to coordinate preservation operations, manage trade relationships, and maintain diplomatic contact with dozens of other tribes. This led to the emergence of specialized roles that hadn't existed before. Preservation masters who understood the complex chemistry of different curing methods, salt miners who knew how to safely extract and transport crystalline deposits, and professional traders who could speak multiple tribal dialects and navigate the complex web of relationships that connected the growing trade network. The world was changing faster than anyone could have imagined, and at the center of it all was an aging caveman who had started this revolution with nothing more than his grandmother's whispered observations about animal behavior. But the greatest changes were still to come, as Grok's innovations began to transform not just how humans stored food, but how they thought about the future itself. 25 winters after his desperate gamble in the salt caves, Grok had become something unprecedented in human history. Salt Father, to a confederation of 17 tribes, his hair white as the crystals that had transformed human destiny. But the title didn't just represent his mastery of preservation techniques, it symbolized a fundamental shift in how humans thought about knowledge itself. The preservation schools he established weren't simply technical training centers where people learned to cure meat. They were philosophical laboratories where observation and experimentation concepts that would have been considered dangerous heresies just a generation earlier became formalized methods of knowledge advancement. Think about how radical this was. Instead of blindly following inherited wisdom, humans were learning to question, test, and improve upon the knowledge of their ancestors. Grok's grandson, Torak, embodied this new approach to learning. Rather than simply mastering his grandfather's techniques, he pushed the boundaries further, discovering that certain molds, when controlled through precise applications of salt and temperature, could create preserved foods with entirely new flavors and nutritional properties. He was essentially laying the groundwork for fermentation science, 30,000 years before anyone would understand the biological processes that made it work. But here's what makes this story so remarkable. The compound effects of reliable food storage rippled through every aspect of human culture in ways that no one could have predicted. Elderly survivors, who under the old system would have been the first to die during harsh times, became living libraries of accumulated wisdom. They could afford to spend time teaching rather than desperately seeking their next meal. Artists could dedicate themselves to cave painting without the constant threat of starvation. Musicians could develop complex songs and stories that preserved not just entertainment, but crucial cultural knowledge. The cognitive surplus created by not constantly seeking food led to innovations in tool-making, early mathematics for tracking stored supplies, and the first abstract thinking about future planning beyond the immediate next season. The story of Yara perfectly illustrates how food security enabled humanity to value diverse talents beyond pure physical strength. Born with a childhood injury that prevented her from hunting, she would have been a burden under the old system, someone the tribe couldn't afford to keep alive during tough times. But in this new world of food abundance, her keen mind and steady hands made her the greatest preservation master of her generation, developing techniques that kept food edible longer than anyone thought possible. Yara's innovations weren't just technical, they were artistic. She created preserved foods that actually tasted better after months of storage than they did fresh. She developed color-coding systems using different herbs and spices that allowed stored food to be organized by nutritional content, seasonal availability, and optimal consumption timing. She essentially invented the first systematic approach to nutrition planning. But perhaps most importantly, these preservation schools became centers of scientific thinking. Students learned to observe natural phenomena, form hypotheses about why things worked the way they did, and test their theories through careful experimentation. This might sound obvious to us, but remember, these people were developing the scientific method from scratch, without any cultural precedent for systematic investigation of natural phenomena. The spring gathering where Grok would die had become something unprecedented. An annual conference where 400 people from dozens of tribes assembled not just to trade and intermarry, but to share knowledge and innovations. Picture the intellectual ferment of these gatherings: master preservationists comparing techniques, young innovators presenting new discoveries, traders sharing intelligence about distant tribes and their unique methods. These weren't just social events. They were humanity's first scientific conferences. People presented their findings, debated the merits of different approaches, and collaborated on solving problems that affected multiple communities. The knowledge sharing that occurred at these gatherings accelerated innovation in ways that would have been impossible when each tribe worked in isolation. Grok's final innovation, revealed on his deathbed at the age of 53 ancient, by Paleolithic standards, represented the culmination of decades of experimentation and refinement. His technique of fermenting meat with salt and specific fungi created portable, high-energy food that remained edible for entire years. This wasn't just preserved food, it was survival technology that enabled human migrations across previously impossible distances. Think about the implications. With food that could last for years without spoiling, humans could undertake journeys that would take them far from any known food sources. They could explore new continents, cross vast oceans, and establish settlements in environments that would have been completely inhospitable under the old preservation methods. As Grok lay dying, surrounded by representatives from tribes that spanned thousands of miles, he could see the transformation his grandmother's observations had wrought. The desperate, starving band of 23 people huddled in a cave had become a civilization of thousands, connected by trade routes, shared knowledge, and common preservation techniques that had spread across the known world. But the most remarkable part of this story isn't what happened 30,000 years ago, it's what happened 30,000 years later. Modern archaeologists, excavating a site in what is now northern Europe, uncovered a preserved meat cache bearing Grok's distinctive triple salt technique signature. The proteins were still intact enough to reveal the DNA of long-extinct animals, mammoths, cave bears, and giant elk that had vanished from the earth millennia ago. This discovery proved something extraordinary. That one caveman's desperate winter gamble didn't just save his family, didn't just transform his tribe, it didn't just revolutionize Paleolithic society, it had saved the entire human project from extinction during the Ice Age. The food security that made civilization possible, the surplus that allowed humans to develop art, science, and complex social structures, all traced back to an old woman watching animals lick salt in caves and a desperate father willing to risk everything on her whispered theories. When we open our refrigerators today, when we plan meals weeks in advance, when we take for granted that food will be available regardless of season or weather, we're benefiting from innovations that began in a smoke-filled cave, where Grok chose experimentation over tradition, observation over inherited wisdom, and hope over despair. The seeds of tomorrow's harvest weren't planted in fertile fields by agricultural pioneers, they were planted in salt caves by a starving man who believed his grandmother's careful observations about animal behavior might hold the key to human survival. And those seeds grew into the abundance that surrounds us today, 30,000 years later, in a world where winter no longer means death, and where the preservation of food has become so reliable that we've forgotten it was ever humanity's greatest challenge. That's the power of innovation, the importance of questioning established wisdom, and the incredible impact that one person's willingness to risk everything on a better idea can have on the entire course of human history.